Right now, in this exact moment, people are being judged, not for what they know, not for their degrees, their resumes, or their years of experience. They are being judged for something far more immediate and far more brutal: the way they speak. Within seconds of opening your mouth, before you've made a single valid point, before anyone has verified a single fact you've stated, a judgment has already been made about your intelligence, your competence, and your authority. This is not a theory. This is not motivational fluff. This is a documented psychological reality. And it is happening to you every single day, in every conversation, every meeting, every interaction, whether you realize it or not. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Some of the smartest people you will ever meet are completely invisible in conversations. They know more than everyone in the room, yet they get talked over, ignored, or dismissed, because they never learned how to make their intelligence audible. Meanwhile, some of the most average thinkers you know walk into any room and instantly command attention. People lean in when they talk. People assume they're brilliant before they've said anything of substance. Why? Because they understood something most people never do. Sounding smart is not about being smart. It is a skill. It is learnable. And once you learn it, it will change every single area of your life: your career, your relationships, your influence, your income. This is not about manipulation, and it's not about faking intelligence you don't have. This is about psychology, the psychology of perception, persuasion, and power. Because here's what nobody tells you: intelligence that isn't perceived might as well not exist. You can be the most brilliant person in the room, but if you can't communicate that brilliance in a way that registers with the human brain's shortcuts for competence, you will be overlooked, underestimated, and passed over again and again. This audiobook is going to dismantle that problem completely. By the time you finish listening, you will understand exactly how the brain decides, in a matter of seconds, whether someone is competent or not. You will know how to control your pacing so that your words carry weight instead of noise. You will understand how tone and pitch signal authority before your message even lands. You will learn to speak with a level of precision that eliminates the noise most people drown their ideas in. You will discover how the words you choose can make an identical idea sound either forgettable or unforgettable. You will learn the counterintuitive truth that listening, not talking, is often the most powerful tool for appearing sharp, and you will learn how to read a room so precisely that you always know exactly how to calibrate what you say and how you say it. This is not passive information. If you listen to this and do nothing, nothing will change. But if you apply even a fraction of what you're about to learn, you will notice something happening almost immediately. People will start listening differently when you talk. They will lean in instead of checking their phones. They will remember what you said instead of forgetting it the moment you finish speaking. They will start deferring to you in conversations where, just weeks earlier, you would have been ignored. This shift is not magic. It is mechanics, and you are about to learn every single piece of that machine. Chapter 1. The Power of Pace and Pausing. Most people believe that speaking quickly is a sign of intelligence, that a fast mind produces fast speech, and that hesitation is a sign of weakness. This belief is not only wrong, it is the exact opposite of the truth, and it is quietly sabotaging the way millions of people are perceived every single day. The human brain does not associate speed with intelligence. It associates speed with anxiety. When someone talks quickly, without pause, rushing from one sentence to the next as if they're afraid of losing the floor, the listener's subconscious does not register brilliance. It registers nervousness, insecurity, and a desperate need to be heard before someone interrupts. This is why so many genuinely intelligent people are underestimated. They know their material is strong, so they rush to get it all out. And in doing so, they broadcast the exact opposite of what they intend. Now consider the alternative. Think about the people you've encountered who speak slowly, who leave space between their sentences, who seem entirely unbothered by silence. What did you assume about them? Chances are you assumed they were in control. You assumed they were thinking carefully, weighing their words, choosing precisely what to say, rather than blurting out whatever came to mind first. This is not an accident of perception. It is a deeply wired psychological pattern. Silence, in the right hands, is not empty space. It is a display of confidence so strong that the speaker doesn't feel the need to fill every gap with sound. People who are anxious cannot tolerate silence. People who are secure can sit inside it comfortably. And that comfort is instantly read by everyone around them as authority. This is why the pause is one of the most underused tools in human communication. A well-placed pause does several things simultaneously. It gives your listener time to actually absorb what you just said, rather than being steamrolled into the next sentence before the first one has landed. It creates anticipation, making people lean forward slightly, waiting for what comes next, which increases the psychological weight of whatever you say afterward. And it signals, without you having to say a single word, that you are not afraid of the moment. You are not rushing because you don't need to rush. You are secure enough in what you're saying to let it breathe. Think about the greatest speakers you've ever watched. The ones who could hold a room in complete silence, with nothing but the sound of their own voice, almost universally. You will notice they do not speak in a constant, unbroken stream. They speak, then stop. They let a sentence land, then wait a beat before continuing. That silence is not dead air. It is doing enormous psychological work. It is training the audience's brain to expect that whatever comes next is worth waiting for and worth remembering. Practically, here is how you begin using pace and pausing to sound more intelligent immediately. When you feel the urge to fill silence with filler words, words like like, or just resist that urge completely. Let the silence sit instead. It will feel unnatural at first, even uncomfortable, because your brain is wired to fear silence as a sign that something has gone wrong. But silence, used deliberately, is not a gap in your competence. It is proof of it. Next, slow your overall pace of speech by roughly 20% from what feels natural. This will feel painfully slow to you internally, but to your listener, it will sound measured, deliberate, and controlled. Finally, practice pausing directly before you say something important, not after, before. This primes the listener's attention right at the moment your key point lands, ensuring it registers rather than getting lost in a wall of continuous sound. The people who dominate rooms are rarely the ones who talk the most or the fastest. They are the ones who understand that speech is not just about words. It's about rhythm, timing, and the psychological effect of controlled silence. Master this, and you will already be ahead of the vast majority of people who never even consider that how fast they talk might be working against them. There's a deeper layer to pacing that goes beyond simply slowing down, and that is variation, a voice that moves at exactly one speed for an entire conversation. Even if that speed is slow and deliberate, eventually starts to sound monotonous. And monotony has its own cost because it stops holding attention. The most compelling speakers vary their pace intentionally. They slow down dramatically when delivering something important, almost to the point where each word feels weighted and separate. And then they allow themselves to move a little faster through supporting details that don't need the same emphasis. This contrast is what creates the sensation of importance. If everything is delivered at the same measured pace, nothing stands out as more significant than anything else. And the listener's brain has no cues to tell it what to remember. Think about how this plays out in a real scenario. Imagine you're explaining a decision to a group of colleagues. If you deliver the entire explanation, from the background context to the actual decision to the reasoning behind it, all at the exact same unbroken pace, the core decision gets buried inside a stream of equally weighted information. But if you speed slightly through the background, then noticeably slow down right as you state the actual decision, pausing just before it and just after it, that decision becomes the clear focal point of the entire exchange. People will remember it because your pacing told their brain, without a single explicit word, that this was the part that mattered. There is also a psychological phenomenon worth understanding here, sometimes called the pratfall of urgency. When people feel time pressure, whether real or imagined, their pace naturally increases, and this creates a feedback loop. The faster they talk, the more anxious they sound. And the more anxious they sound, the more internal pressure they feel to rush and finish the thought before they lose the room, which makes them talk even faster. Breaking this loop requires a conscious, almost physical intervention. The next time you notice your own pace accelerating under pressure, deliberately insert a pause, even an artificial one, right in the middle of the moment. This interrupts the feedback loop and resets your rhythm before the anxiety compounds. It's worth practicing this outside of high-stakes situations first, because trying to master a new pacing pattern for the first time during an important presentation or negotiation is setting yourself up to fail. Practice slowing your pace and inserting pauses in low-stakes daily conversations, ordering coffee, chatting with a coworker, explaining something simple to a friend. The goal is to make deliberate pacing feel natural before you need to rely on it in a moment that actually matters. Like any physical skill, the timing of speech becomes automatic only through repetition, and repetition in low-pressure settings builds the muscle memory that will hold up when the pressure is on. Chapter 2. Vocal authority. Words carry meaning, but tone carries power. This is something most people never consciously think about, yet it shapes every single interaction they have. You can say the exact same sentence in two completely different tones and produce two completely different psychological effects on the listener. One version will sound uncertain, apologetic, almost as if you're asking permission to have an opinion. The other version using the identical words, will sound like a statement of fact, delivered by someone who has no doubts whatsoever. The words never changed. Only the tone did. And yet the perceived intelligence, competence, and authority of the speaker shifted entirely. One of the most damaging vocal habits, and one that almost nobody notices in themselves, is upward inflection at the end of statements, sometimes called uptalk. This is when a sentence that should end with a firm, downward tone instead rises in pitch at the end, making it sound like a question even though it was never meant to be one. When you say something like, "I think this plan could work," and your voice rises at the very end, the listener's brain interprets this as uncertainty, as if you are checking whether your own idea is acceptable rather than stating it as true. Over time, this habit trains everyone around you to doubt your convictions, because you are unconsciously signaling doubt about them yourself. The fix is what is often called the downward inflection, and it is remarkably simple once you're aware of it. At the end of a statement, especially one you want to be taken seriously, let your pitch drop slightly rather than rise. This single adjustment transforms a sentence from something that sounds like a nervous question into something that sounds like an established fact. Try saying a sentence in your mind and imagine your voice falling gently at the final word rather than climbing. That falling tone is the sound of certainty, and certainty is one of the most powerful psychological triggers for perceived intelligence that exists. Pitch itself matters as well. Research into vocal perception consistently shows that lower-pitched voices are associated with authority, competence, and trustworthiness, while higher-pitched voices, particularly when strained or tense, are associated with nervousness and lower status. This does not mean you need to artificially deepen your voice into something unnatural, which will sound forced and actually undermine your credibility. It means understanding that when you speak from a relaxed, grounded place, rather than a tight, high, anxious register, your natural resonance drops, and that drop alone makes you sound more composed and more in control. Breath is the foundation underneath all of this, and it is almost never talked about. When people are nervous, their breathing becomes shallow and rapid, originating from the upper chest rather than the diaphragm. This shallow breathing directly causes the voice to sound thin, strained, and higher pitched. Exactly the qualities that read as anxious rather than authoritative. Before any moment where you want to sound powerful, whether it's a meeting, a presentation, or even a casual conversation where you want to be taken seriously, take one slow breath from your diaphragm, letting your stomach expand rather than your chest rising. This single physical adjustment changes your entire vocal resonance and gives your words a grounded, steady quality that people instinctively associate with confidence and intelligence. Volume plays its own subtle role as well, though not in the way most people assume. Loudness is often mistaken for confidence, but excessive volume, especially when paired with rapid speech, actually reads as aggression or insecurity, trying to overcompensate. True vocal authority comes from steadiness rather than loudness. A voice that stays consistent, that doesn't spike erratically in volume or pitch when the speaker feels challenged, communicates far more control than a voice that gets louder and faster under pressure. The next time you feel challenged in a conversation, notice the urge to raise your volume, and instead, consciously keep it level. That composure alone will separate you from almost everyone else in the room. Articulation deserves attention as well. because mumbled or rushed consonants create an impression of carelessness, even when the underlying content is excellent. This does not mean speaking in an exaggerated, theatrical way that calls attention to itself. It means making sure the ends of your words are not swallowed, that final consonants are actually completed rather than trailing off into vague sound. Try recording yourself speaking naturally for a minute, and then listening back. Most people are surprised to hear how many word endings disappear entirely, replaced by a kind of vocal shrug. Cleaning this up, without becoming stiff or overly formal, adds a layer of crispness that reads as competence almost immediately. There is also the matter of vocal fry, the low, creaky quality that sometimes appears at the end of sentences when the vocal cords relax and the airflow decreases. While vocal fry has become common in casual speech, especially at the end of statements, it can undercut authority in more formal or high-stakes settings because it often sounds like the energy of the sentence is collapsing rather than landing with conviction. Maintaining steady breath support through the entire sentence, rather than letting it run out right at the final words, prevents this collapse and keeps the ending of your sentences as strong as the beginning. Consider also how tone shifts depending on whether you are stating something or defending something. When people feel challenged, their instinct is often to speak faster and at a higher pitch, almost as if trying to outrun the challenge itself. But the moment where your tone matters most is exactly the moment where it's hardest to control, which is why it's worth deliberately practicing staying low and slow, specifically in moments of pushback. The next time someone disagrees with you or questions your point, notice your own instinct to speed up and rise in pitch, and consciously do the opposite. Slow down. Drop your pitch slightly. This single adjustment, made precisely in the moment of friction, is often what separates someone who sounds rattled from someone who sounds unshakable. Finally, understand that vocal authority is not about performing a persona that isn't you. It's about removing the habits that were never actually serving you in the first place. The nervous uptalk, the shallow breathing, the rushed articulation, and allowing your natural voice to operate from a place of groundedness rather than anxiety. The goal isn't to sound like someone else. It's to sound like the calmest, most settled version of yourself. Because that version, it turns out, is the one people instinctively trust. Chapter 3. Precision over volume. There is a widespread and deeply mistaken belief that saying more makes you sound smarter, that the more words you use, the more thorough and knowledgeable you appear. In reality, the opposite is almost always true. The people who are perceived as the most intelligent in any room are rarely the ones who talk the longest. They are the ones who say exactly what needs to be said, with no wasted words, and then stop. Precision, not volume of speech, is what the brain associates with mastery, because precision signals that the speaker has already done the thinking and distilled it down to its essential core, rather than thinking out loud in real time and hoping something useful emerges. Consider two people asked the same question in a meeting. The first person responds with a long, winding answer, circling the point several times, adding qualifiers, backtracking, restating things slightly differently, and eventually arriving at a conclusion buried somewhere in the middle of several minutes of talking. The second person responds with a single, clear sentence that directly answers the question, and then stops talking. Even if the first person's answer contained more information, the second person will almost always be perceived as more intelligent more competent, and more in control. This is because the brain equates unnecessary length with unprocessed thought, while brevity signals that the thinking has already happened internally, and only the conclusion needed to be shared. Filler words are one of the biggest saboteurs of perceived precision, and most people use them constantly, without ever noticing. Words like like, sort of, kind of, basically, and I mean act as verbal padding that fills silence but adds no actual content. Every time you insert one of these words, you are subtly telling the listener that you are still processing your thought in real time, rather than delivering something already fully formed. Eliminating filler words is one of the fastest ways to sound instantly sharper, and it starts with simply becoming aware of how often you use them. Most people are shocked when they actually track their own speech and realize how frequently these words appear. Hedging language is another silent killer of perceived intelligence. Phrases like, I think, maybe, I could be wrong, but, or it's probably not a big deal, but all function as verbal insurance policies, protecting the speaker from being wrong by softening their claims in advance. The problem is that this hedging, used excessively, makes even correct and valuable ideas sound tentative and unreliable. This does not mean you should state everything with false certainty or pretend to know things you don't. It means reserving hedging language for situations where genuine uncertainty exists, rather than using it as a reflexive habit to avoid the discomfort of stating something plainly. Economy of language extends beyond individual words into the structure of entire responses. Before answering a question, especially in a high-stakes setting, take a half-second to identify the single most important point you want to make, and lead with that point first. Most people do the opposite. They build up to their point through background, context, and justification, forcing the listener to wait until the end to understand what they're actually trying to say. By the time the point arrives, much of the listener's attention has already drifted. Leading with your conclusion first, then briefly supporting it if needed, mirrors exactly how the sharpest communicators operate, and it trains your listener to associate your voice with clarity rather than confusion. There is also a specific discipline in knowing when to stop talking, which is arguably harder than knowing what to say. Once you've made your point clearly, resist the urge to keep talking to fill the silence that follows. This is one of the most common mistakes intelligent people make. They say something sharp and well-formed, and then, uncomfortable with the pause that follows, they immediately undercut it by adding unnecessary qualifications or restating the same idea in a weaker form. Say your point. Then stop completely. Let it sit in the room. The silence after a precise statement is not empty. It is the sound of your point being absorbed. There's a useful mental model for building this skill, sometimes called the headline test. Before you speak in any situation where you want to sound sharp, ask yourself what the headline of your response would be if it had to fit in a single short sentence. Once you've identified that headline, deliver it first. Then decide whether any additional detail is genuinely necessary, or whether the headline alone is sufficient. Most of the time, people discover that far less additional detail is needed than they assumed, because the impulse to elaborate often comes from a fear of being misunderstood or a desire to prove effort rather than from the actual requirements of the conversation. It also helps to understand why over-explaining happens in the first place. because awareness of the underlying cause makes it easier to interrupt the habit. Over-explaining is frequently driven by anxiety, a subconscious fear that a short answer will be seen as lazy, dismissive, or insufficiently thorough. This fear leads people to keep adding qualifiers and extra context, as if piling on more words will somehow prove they've done the work. But the opposite effect occurs. Excess words dilute the strength of the actual point, burying it under layers of unnecessary justification, and listeners walk away with a vaguer impression rather than a sharper one. Recognizing this pattern in yourself is the first step to breaking it. The next time you notice the urge to add just one more clarifying sentence after you've already made your point, treat that urge as a signal to stop talking, not a signal to keep going. Precision also extends to word choice at the sentence level, not just the length of an answer. Vague qualifiers like very, really, quite, and just add almost no informational value and often signal underdeveloped thought. Compare the sentence, "This is a really big problem," to "This problem will cost us 3 weeks if left unresolved." The second version replaces a vague intensifier with a specific, concrete consequence, and that specificity does far more work in convincing the listener of the seriousness of the issue than any amount of emphasis on the word big. Training yourself to replace vague intensifiers with concrete specifics, even in casual conversation, sharpens the overall precision of your speech patterns over time. Finally, understand that precision is not the same as coldness or terseness for its own sake. The goal is never to sound abrupt or dismissive. It is to eliminate the words that add nothing while keeping every word that adds real meaning. A precise communicator can still be warm, still be detailed when detail is genuinely useful, and still tell a story when a story serves the point. The discipline is in constantly asking whether each additional sentence is earning its place, or whether it's simply filling space because silence felt uncomfortable. Chapter 4. The Framing Effect. The exact same fact, presented in 2 different ways, can produce 2 completely different perceptions of the person delivering it. This is the framing effect, and it is one of the most powerful and least understood tools in the psychology of speech. It is not about lying, exaggerating, or manipulating the truth. It is about understanding that information does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside language, and the specific language chosen to deliver a piece of information shapes how competent, confident, and credible the speaker appears, independent of whether the underlying facts have changed at all. Consider the difference between saying, "I'm not totally sure, but I think this might work," and saying, "Based on what we know, this approach gives us the strongest chance of success." Both statements could be describing the exact same level of underlying certainty. Neither one is dishonest, but the second statement frames that same uncertainty in terms of probability and strategy rather than personal doubt, and the listener's brain responds to it entirely differently. The first version centers the speaker's insecurity. The second version centers the strength of the analysis. This single shift in framing, without changing a single underlying fact, transforms how intelligent and prepared the speaker sounds. Certainty language versus hedging language is one of the clearest examples of this effect. Compare, "I guess we could try this," to "This is the direction we should take." The second version does not claim more certainty about the outcome than the first, but it claims more certainty about the reasoning process. And that is what registers as intelligence. People do not need you to be right about the future. Nobody can be certain about the future. What they need is to feel that your thinking process is sound, decisive, and well-reasoned. And certainty language communicates exactly that, even when the actual outcome remains genuinely uncertain. Reframing problems as challenges and challenges as opportunities follows the same underlying psychological mechanism. If someone describes a difficult situation using language soaked in helplessness, this is a disaster. Everything is falling apart. We're completely stuck. The listener absorbs not just the facts of the situation, but the emotional framing around it, and begins to see the speaker as overwhelmed and reactive. If instead the same situation is described using language of agency and strategy, this is a difficult constraint. But here's what it opens up for us. The listener absorbs an entirely different impression, one of someone who processes difficulty analytically rather than emotionally. The facts of the situation have not changed. The frame around them has, and that frame becomes inseparable from how the speaker is judged. Specificity is another powerful framing tool that most people underuse. Vague language, like "a lot of people," or "things went pretty well," or "we made some progress," signals a lack of precision in thinking, because vague language is what people default to when they haven't actually processed the details carefully. Specific language, such as "engagement increased by roughly a third over the last quarter," or 3 of the 5 test cases failed for the same underlying reason, immediately signals that real analysis has taken place. You don't need access to perfect data to use this technique. Even qualitative specificity, describing exactly what happened rather than gesturing vaguely at an outcome, makes you sound like someone who pays close attention rather than someone who skims the surface. Active voice versus passive voice is a subtler but equally important framing choice. "Mistakes were made" carries an entirely different psychological weight than "I made a mistake here, and here's what I'm doing about it." Passive voice removes the actor from the sentence, which can make a speaker sound evasive or disconnected from responsibility, while active voice places the speaker directly inside the action, which reads as ownership and confidence even when admitting fault. Learning to default to active voice, especially when discussing your own decisions and actions, is one of the simplest structural shifts that consistently makes speech sound sharper and more authoritative. Framing also operates at the level of what you choose to emphasize first in any explanation, sometimes called the anchor point. Whatever piece of information you present first tends to disproportionately shape the listener's overall impression of everything that follows. A phenomenon well documented across psychology as the anchoring effect. If you begin an explanation with the weakest or most negative piece of information, the listener's baseline impression is set low, and everything afterward is filtered through that initial negative frame, even if the overall picture is actually strong. If instead you begin with the strongest, most relevant piece of information, the listener's baseline impression is set high, and subsequent details are filtered through a more favorable lens. This is not about hiding weaknesses. It's about sequencing information so that the anchor point reflects the truest, most important part of the picture, rather than an incidental detail that happens to come to mind first. Comparative framing is another tool worth understanding deeply. The same number can sound dramatically different depending on what it's compared against. Saying "we improved by 10% sounds modest on its own, but saying "we improved by 10%, which is more than double the industry average, transforms the exact same fact into something that sounds genuinely impressive. This is not deception. because the comparison itself is true. It's simply providing the context that allows the listener to correctly calibrate how significant a number actually is, rather than leaving them to guess at a scale they have no reference point for. There is also a distinction worth drawing between framing something as a problem to be solved versus framing it as a decision already being handled. Compare, "We have an issue with the current approach," to "We're adjusting the approach based on what we've learned." Both sentences may describe an identical underlying situation, but the first frames the speaker as someone reporting a problem they haven't yet resolved, while the second frames the speaker as someone already in control of the solution. This shift from problem framing to solution framing is one of the most consistently effective techniques for sounding more capable in professional settings, particularly when delivering information that could otherwise sound like an admission of failure. It's worth being careful here, because framing crosses a line into manipulation the moment it starts distorting the underlying truth, rather than simply presenting it clearly. The techniques described in this chapter are not about making bad ideas sound good or making failures disappear through clever language. They are about making sure that accurate, well-reasoned thinking is not accidentally undersold by weak or careless framing. Used honestly, framing ensures that the quality of your thinking is actually reflected in how it lands, rather than being lost in translation between your mind and the listener's ears. Chapter 5. Listening as a speech weapon. It seems counterintuitive, but one of the most powerful tools for sounding intelligent has almost nothing to do with talking at all. It has to do with listening, and specifically, with a very particular, deliberate kind of listening that most people never practice. In nearly every conversation, most participants are not actually listening to understand. They are listening to respond. While the other person is still speaking, they are already mentally rehearsing what they're going to say next, which means they absorb only a fraction of what was actually said. This half-listening is instantly detectable, even if the other person can't consciously name why the conversation feels shallow. And the person who breaks this pattern, who actually listens fully before responding, stands out immediately as someone operating on a different level entirely. Strategic listening begins with resisting the urge to formulate your response while the other person is still talking. This is far harder than it sounds, because the brain is wired to want to jump in, to prepare its rebuttal, its addition, its next point, the moment it recognizes the shape of what's being said. But when you allow yourself to fully receive what someone is saying, without simultaneously drafting your reply, something remarkable happens. Your eventual response becomes sharper, more relevant, and more precisely tailored to what was actually said, rather than being a pre-loaded statement you are going to deliver regardless of the conversation's direction. People can feel the difference between a response that was truly built from what they said and a response that was simply waiting for a gap to be inserted. One of the most underused techniques in this space is the callback, referencing something someone said earlier in the conversation, sometimes minutes or even much later, in a way that shows it genuinely registered. When you say, going back to what you mentioned earlier about the timeline, this connects directly to it. You are doing something that instantly separates you from almost everyone else in the conversation. You are proving, in a way that cannot be faked, that you are actually processing their words rather than waiting for your turn. This single move creates a powerful psychological effect. The other person feels genuinely heard, often for the first time, in a long time. And that feeling becomes directly associated with you as someone perceptive, sharp, and worth talking to. Asking a precise follow-up question, rather than immediately offering your own opinion, is another way listening functions as a weapon of perceived intelligence. When someone shares an idea and your first response is a sharp, specific question that digs one layer deeper into what they just said, rather than an immediate reaction or counterpoint, it signals that you are actually engaging with the substance of their idea rather than simply waiting to insert your own. This is deeply counterintuitive to most people who feel pressure to have an immediate opinion ready. But a well-placed question often demonstrates more intelligence than an immediate answer, because it shows you understood the idea well enough to identify exactly where it needs more exploration. Silence, once again, plays a role here as well. After someone finishes speaking, resist the urge to respond instantly. A brief pause before you reply signals that you actually took in what they said and are responding thoughtfully rather than firing back a reflexive reaction. This pause, often less than 2 full seconds, is almost never consciously noticed by the other person, but it is felt. It changes the entire tone of the exchange from a rapid back and forth to something that feels more considered, more weighted, and more intelligent on both sides. There is a final layer to this, which is that people who listen exceptionally well are consistently rated by others as more intelligent than they actually test on objective measures. And people who talk the most in group settings are consistently rated as less intelligent than they actually test, despite the common assumption that talking more demonstrates more knowledge. This finding, replicated across multiple studies of group dynamics, reveals something crucial. Perceived intelligence is not primarily a measure of how much you know or even how much you say. It is a measure of how well you make others feel heard, understood, and engaged, and listening, done with genuine focus and skill, accomplishes that more powerfully than almost anything you could say. There's a specific technique within strategic listening worth isolating on its own, sometimes called reflective summarizing. This is the practice of briefly restating, in your own words, the core of what someone just said before responding to it. Something as simple as, "So what you're saying is the timeline is the real constraint here," not the budget, accomplishes several things simultaneously. It confirms to the other person that you actually understood them correctly, giving them the chance to clarify if you didn't. It buys you a brief moment to organize your own response with more precision. And it demonstrates, in a way that is immediately obvious to everyone in the conversation, that you were tracking the substance of what was said, rather than simply waiting for your turn. People who use reflective summarizing consistently are perceived as unusually sharp listeners, even if their actual comprehension is no different from anyone else's, simply because they make their comprehension visible. It's also worth understanding what breaks this technique, because listening can be performed badly in ways that undermine the entire effect. Nodding along mechanically while clearly thinking about something else is usually detectable, because the responses that follow don't actually connect to what was said, interrupting with a related but different point, rather than responding directly to the actual content just shared, signals that you were listening for an opening rather than listening to understand. And overusing reflective summarizing, restating everything back mechanically regardless of whether it's needed, starts to feel more like a technique than genuine engagement. The goal is never to perform listening, It's to actually listen and let the outward signals of that listening emerge naturally from real attention rather than from a memorized script. There's a final point worth making about the relationship between listening and intelligence that ties this entire chapter together. Genuinely sharp thinkers tend to ask better questions than average thinkers, not because they know more facts, but because they've trained themselves to notice the gaps, the assumptions, and the unstated implications in what someone else has said. This noticing only happens when full attention is actually being given to the other person's words. The person who is half listening while planning their own response will never notice these gaps because their attention was never fully present in the first place. Building the habit of complete, undivided listening is not just a communication technique. It is, in a very real sense, a form of thinking, and it is one of the most reliable paths toward being perceived as, and eventually actually becoming, one of the sharpest people in any room you enter. Chapter 6. Reading the room. Every room you walk into operates by a different set of unspoken rules, and the people who consistently sound intelligent are the ones who can sense those rules almost instantly and adjust accordingly. This is not about being fake or having no real personality of your own. It's about understanding that the exact same message, delivered identically in two different contexts, can land as brilliant in one setting and completely tone-deaf in another. Intelligence is never judged in a vacuum. It is judged relative to what is appropriate for the specific audience, the specific stakes, and the specific expectations of that moment. And the people who ignore this reality are consistently underestimated no matter how good their ideas actually are. The first layer of reading a room is registering the formality level already present before you speak at all. Walk into a boardroom full of executives in tailored suits, speaking in clipped, efficient sentences, and the register of that room has already been set before you say a single word. Match that register roughly, not by pretending to be someone you're not, but by tightening your own language, cutting casual phrasing, and speaking with the same kind of economy you're observing around you. Walk into a casual team brainstorm where people are joking, interrupting each other, and speaking loosely and rigidly formal language will make you sound stiff and disconnected rather than intelligent. The room has already told you what kind of communication it rewards. Your job is to notice that signal and calibrate to it. Vocabulary is one of the most common places where people misjudge the room entirely. There is a widespread and mistaken belief that using complex, technical, or elevated vocabulary is the fastest way to sound smart. In reality, using vocabulary that is mismatched to your audience does the opposite. If you are speaking to a group of specialists in a technical field, using the precise, dense terminology of that field signals fluency and earns immediate credibility because it proves you belong in the conversation at their level. But use that exact same dense, jargon-heavy language with a general audience unfamiliar with the field, and instead of sounding intelligent, you sound like you're either showing off or, worse, unable to translate your own expertise into something usable. The truly intelligent move is not complexity for its own sake. It's adjusting the complexity of your language precisely to the level that will land as clear and impressive for that specific audience, which sometimes means simplifying dramatically and sometimes means getting more technical than you would in casual conversation. This adaptability, often called code switching, extends beyond vocabulary into rhythm, tone, and even humor. Some rooms reward directness and quick, punchy exchanges. Others reward a slower, more deliberate, almost ceremonial pace, where interrupting or rushing to a point feels disrespectful. Some rooms welcome humor as a way to build rapport and show quick thinking. Others treat humor, especially if mistimed, as a sign that you're not taking the situation seriously. None of these preferences are universal or fixed. They shift from room to room, and the ability to notice which mode you're in within the first few minutes, sometimes within the first few seconds, is a skill that separates people who consistently land well from people who consistently misjudge their audience. There's a practical method for developing this skill quickly, which is to spend the first portion of any new interaction observing more than talking. Notice how long other people's sentences are. Notice whether they use casual contractions or more formal, complete phrasing. Notice whether silence is comfortable in this room or whether people rush to fill every gap. Notice the emotional temperature, whether people are relaxed and joking or tense and focused. All of this information is available within the first few minutes of almost any interaction, and using that window to calibrate rather than immediately launching into your own default communication style is one of the most reliable ways to ensure that whatever you eventually say lands the way you intend it to. It's important to draw a clear distinction here between adapting your communication style and abandoning your actual substance or opinions. Reading the room is not about telling people what they want to hear or hiding disagreement to fit in. It's entirely possible, and often more effective, to disagree with a room while still matching its register and rhythm. You can deliver a contrarian point in a slow, measured, formal boardroom, exactly as formally and measuredly as everyone else, and it will land as thoughtful pushback rather than disruption. Deliver that same contrarian point with mismatched energy. Too casual, too aggressive, too rushed, and even a correct point can get dismissed simply because of how jarring the delivery felt relative to the room around it. There's a particular skill worth developing here, which is the ability to shift register mid-conversation as the room itself shifts. Meetings rarely stay in one mode for their entire duration. A conversation might open formally, loosen into something more casual once rapport is established, then tighten back up the moment a difficult decision needs to be made. People who sound consistently sharp are the ones who track these shifts in real time and adjust their own delivery accordingly, rather than locking into a single mode at the start and staying there, regardless of how the room around them evolves. This requires a kind of ongoing attentiveness that goes beyond the first few minutes of calibration and continues throughout the entire interaction. It also helps to understand that different rooms reward different ratios of listening to speaking. In some settings, particularly ones involving senior stakeholders or unfamiliar audiences, the safest and most effective initial strategy is to speak less and observe more, gathering information about what this particular group values before committing to a strong position. In other settings, especially ones where you already have established credibility or where the group explicitly expects proactive contribution, staying too quiet for too long can itself become a mistake. Read as disengagement or lack of confidence rather than thoughtful restraint. Correctly judging which mode a given room calls for, quiet observation or active contribution, is itself a form of the situational intelligence this entire chapter is about. And getting it wrong in either direction carries a real cost. Cultural and generational context also shapes what reads as intelligent communication. And this is worth acknowledging honestly. rather than pretending one universal style works everywhere. What sounds appropriately direct and efficient in one professional culture can sound abrupt or even rude in another. What sounds respectfully deferential in one context can sound weak or overly cautious in another. There is no single fixed formula that works identically across every room you will ever enter, and pretending otherwise sets you up to misjudge situations that don't match your default assumptions. The underlying skill being built throughout this chapter is not a fixed script. It's the flexible, ongoing habit of observing before assuming and adjusting your delivery based on what the actual room in front of you is signaling, rather than what worked in the last room you were in. Chapter 7. The Confidence-Competence Loop. There is a tight, self-reinforcing relationship between how confident you appear and how competent people assume you are. And understanding this loop is essential because most people get the sequence backwards. The common assumption is that confidence should come after competence, that you earn the right to sound sure of yourself only once you've proven you deserve it. But in practice, perceived confidence is often what causes people to grant you the benefit of the doubt regarding your competence in the first place, long before you've had the chance to actually prove anything. This is not entirely fair, and it's not the way the world should necessarily work. But understanding how it actually functions gives you the ability to use it rather than be disadvantaged by it. Body posture, even in a purely audio-focused context, shapes the voice in ways that listeners can detect without ever seeing you. Someone speaking while physically slouched, with their shoulders collapsed and their chest constricted, produces a noticeably different vocal quality than someone speaking while sitting or standing upright with an open chest. The upright posture allows for fuller breath support, which translates directly into a steadier, more resonant voice, the same steady, grounded tone discussed earlier in relation to vocal authority. This means that even in a phone call or a voice-only setting where nobody can see your posture, your physical posture is still shaping how confident and competent you sound because it's shaping the mechanics of your voice itself. The loop works in both directions, which is the part most people never realize. Not only does confidence shape how competent you sound, but deliberately adjusting your vocal delivery toward confident patterns, even before you feel fully confident internally, actually begins to shift your internal state as well. This is sometimes described as behavioral activation, the idea that action can precede and actually generate the internal state you're trying to reach, rather than always waiting for the internal state to arrive first before acting. If you wait until you feel completely confident before speaking with confident vocal patterns, you may wait indefinitely, because confidence often only fully arrives after repeated experience of things going well. But if you adopt the vocal patterns of confidence, the steady pace, the downward inflection, the grounded tone, even while your internal state feels uncertain, you begin accumulating experiences of being received as competent, and those experiences are what eventually build genuine internal confidence. There is a specific trap worth naming here, sometimes called the competence spiral in reverse. When someone feels uncertain internally, their voice often reflects that uncertainty through faster pace, higher pitch, and more hedging language. The listener then picks up on these signals and responds with slightly less trust, slightly more skepticism, slightly more pushback. The speaker notices this reduced trust, which increases their internal anxiety further, which then further degrades their vocal delivery, creating a downward spiral where each round makes the situation slightly worse. Breaking this spiral requires an intentional intervention at the vocal level, because trying to simply feel more confident internally without changing anything about the actual delivery rarely interrupts the spiral in the moment it's happening. The fastest lever available in a real-time situation is almost always the mechanical one, slowing the pace, dropping the pitch, inserting a pause, rather than the purely psychological one of trying to talk yourself into feeling differently. It's worth being honest about the limits of this loop as well. Confidence-driven delivery can create a strong first impression, but it cannot indefinitely substitute for actual substance. If someone sounds highly confident but consistently delivers weak or inaccurate content, the gap between the delivery and the substance eventually becomes visible. And when it does, the cost is often steeper than if the person had never projected excess confidence in the first place, because it starts to read as arrogance rather than genuine capability. The goal of using this loop is not to fake competence you don't have. It's to make sure that competence you genuinely do have is not undersold by a delivery style that accidentally signals the opposite. There's a useful way to think about calibrating this correctly, which is to separate confidence about your process from confidence about your outcome. You can speak with complete, grounded certainty about how carefully you approached a problem, what factors you considered, and why you reached the conclusion you did, even in situations where the ultimate outcome remains genuinely uncertain. This is different from projecting false certainty about outcomes you cannot actually guarantee, which risks credibility the moment reality doesn't match the confident prediction. The most respected communicators tend to be those who sound completely sure of their reasoning while remaining appropriately humble about predictions, a combination that reads as both confident and honest at the same time, rather than either falsely certain or unnecessarily tentative. It's also worth understanding how this loop interacts with recovery from mistakes, because everyone eventually says something wrong or gets caught off guard by a question they can't fully answer. The instinct in that moment is often to let the internal panic bleed directly into vocal delivery, speeding up, apologizing repeatedly, losing the grounded tone built up until that point. But the confidence-competence loop still applies here. A calm, measured acknowledgement of a gap. Something along the lines of, "That's a detail I'd need to check before answering with certainty," delivered in the same steady tone as everything before it, reads as far more competent than a flustered, rapid attempt to cover the gap with improvised information. Mistakes and uncertainty are inevitable. What determines the impact on perceived competence is not whether they happen, but whether the vocal delivery around them stays steady or collapses. There's also a longer-term version of this loop worth understanding. Beyond any single conversation, every interaction where your confident, grounded delivery lands well and is met with trust and positive response becomes a small piece of evidence your own mind uses to build genuine, lasting self-assurance. Over time, this accumulates into something more durable than situational confidence built for a single moment. It becomes a stable trait, a general sense that you are someone whose voice carries weight, and that internal shift, once it takes hold, starts to show up automatically, without conscious effort, in situations you haven't even specifically prepared for. This is the real long-term payoff of deliberately practicing these vocal patterns, even when they don't yet feel fully natural. The practice itself, repeated enough times, eventually stops being practice and simply becomes who you are when you speak. Chapter 8. The Art of Storytelling as Proof of Intelligence. Facts and data are often assumed to be the most convincing form of communication, the purest evidence of intelligence, because they seem objective and undeniable. But raw facts, delivered without any narrative structure around them, are remarkably easy to forget, and information that isn't remembered has essentially no impact, regardless of how accurate it was. This is where storytelling becomes one of the most underestimated tools available to anyone trying to sound sharp and credible. A well-told story does not replace facts. It carries them, embeds them into a structure the human brain is naturally wired to retain, and makes the underlying intelligence behind the point far more memorable than the same information delivered as a flat list of statements. The human brain evolved to process and remember narrative long before it developed the capacity for abstract statistical reasoning, which means stories are processed through older, more deeply wired cognitive pathways than raw data. When you deliver a point purely as an abstract claim, this approach increased efficiency by 20%. The listener's brain registers it as information to be filed away, and filed-away information decays quickly from memory. When you deliver the same point wrapped in a brief, concrete narrative, we had a specific case where a change we made saved a full day of work. By the end of the week, the listener's brain engages differently, visualizing the scenario. And that visualization creates a much stickier memory trace. Weeks later, people are far more likely to remember the story than the isolated statistic. And if they remember the story, they remember your point. And if they remember your point, they remember you as the person who explained something in a way that actually stuck. There is a specific structure that separates effective stories used in conversation from rambling anecdotes that lose the listener's attention. The most effective version is remarkably short, often no more than a few sentences, and follows a simple shape: a specific situation, a specific tension or problem within that situation, and a specific resolution or insight that emerged from it. The mistake most people make when trying to use storytelling is including far too much irrelevant detail, describing the setting extensively, explaining every person involved, building up context that the listener doesn't actually need in order to grasp the point. A story used to prove intelligence in conversation is not the same as a story told for pure entertainment. It is compressed, purposeful, and stripped down to only the elements that serve the underlying point you're trying to make. Specificity, once again, plays a crucial role here, just as it did in earlier chapters on framing and precision. A vague story, "We tried something new and it worked out well," carries almost no persuasive weight because it could describe almost any situation and therefore proves nothing specific about your thinking or judgment. A specific story, "We changed the review process from weekly to daily, and within 2 weeks the number of last-minute errors dropped by more than half," carries far more weight because the specificity itself signals that you are paying close enough attention to actually track the details of what happened, rather than offering a vague, generic account that could have been fabricated or misremembered. Stories are also one of the most effective tools for handling difficult or sensitive topics without sounding either evasive or overly blunt. Rather than making a purely abstract claim about a difficult subject, which can come across as preachy or theoretical, framing the same insight through a brief, specific example allows the listener to draw their own conclusion, which is almost always more persuasive than being told directly what to think. This indirect method of persuasion letting the story do the convincing rather than stating the conclusion outright, is a technique used consistently by the most effective communicators because people are naturally more receptive to insights. They feel they arrived at themselves rather than insights that were forced upon them directly. Building a personal library of these compressed stories ahead of time is one of the most practical ways to put this chapter into action. Rather than trying to improvise a relevant story in the exact moment you need one, which often produces something meandering and unfocused, take time separately, away from any live conversation, to identify a handful of specific experiences from your own life or work that illustrate the points you find yourself making most often. Refine each one down to its essential shape: the situation, the tension, the resolution, until it can be told in under 30 seconds. Having even 3 or 4 of these polished, ready-to-deploy stories on hand transforms your ability to sound sharp and prepared in the moments that actually matter, because you're not inventing a narrative under pressure, you're retrieving one you've already shaped carefully in advance. It's also worth noting how storytelling interacts with the earlier chapter on precision. There is a temptation, once you recognize the power of narrative, to overcorrect and start telling long, elaborate stories in every conversation, which quickly becomes its own new version of the over-explaining trap discussed elsewhere in this material. The discipline is in using story sparingly, reserving it for the specific moments where a point genuinely benefits from being made memorable, rather than defaulting to narrative for every single statement. A well-timed, brief story surrounded by otherwise precise, direct communication stands out far more than a conversation where every point gets wrapped in its own anecdote, which quickly becomes exhausting for the listener and dilutes the impact of the technique entirely. Finally, consider how storytelling can be used specifically to demonstrate judgment rather than just knowledge. A story that ends with a straightforward positive outcome demonstrates that something worked, but a story that includes a moment of difficulty, a wrong turn, or an unexpected complication that had to be navigated demonstrates something more valuable: the actual thinking process used to handle uncertainty in real time. These slightly more complex stories, ones that don't present a perfectly smooth path from problem to solution, often land as more credible and more impressive than idealized success stories, precisely because they mirror how real problems actually unfold, and because they give the listener a window into how you think under pressure rather than just what you eventually accomplished. Chapter 9. Common traps that make you sound less intelligent. Even people who understand every principle covered so far can still undermine themselves through a handful of common habits that quietly sabotage how intelligent they sound, often without any awareness that these habits are even happening. Recognizing these traps is just as important as learning the positive techniques, because a single one of these habits, repeated consistently, can cancel out the benefit of everything else you've learned. The first and most common trap is excessive self-deprecation disguised as humility. Phrases like, "This might be a dumb question, but," or "I'm probably wrong about this, but," feel socially safe because they lower expectations and protect the speaker from embarrassment if the point turns out to be flawed. But this protection comes at a real cost. It primes the listener to evaluate whatever follows through a skeptical, lowered expectation lens before they've even heard the actual content. True humility does not require verbally diminishing yourself before you speak. It's entirely possible to be open to being wrong, and even to explicitly invite correction, without prefacing every statement with language that signals you don't trust your own thinking. The second trap is over-apologizing, which often shows up as a reflexive habit rather than a genuine response to an actual mistake. Saying sorry to interrupt, sorry, just one more thing, or sorry, if this is a silly point, repeatedly throughout a conversation trains the listener to associate you with apology and uncertainty rather than confidence and clarity. Reserve apologies for situations that genuinely warrant them, an actual mistake, an actual inconvenience caused to someone else, and eliminate the reflexive, apologetic language that has become an automatic, verbal tick disconnected from any real wrongdoing. The third trap is what might be called the qualifier stack, where a single statement gets buried under multiple layers of hedging in a row. I could be wrong, but I sort of feel like maybe this approach might possibly work better. Stacks 4 separate hedges onto a single idea, and by the time the listener reaches the actual content, the cumulative effect of all that hedging has almost entirely drained the statement of any perceived conviction. Even people who understand the danger of a single hedge often don't realize how much worse the effect becomes when hedges are stacked together, each one compounding the uncertainty signaled by the last. The fourth trap is answering questions that weren't actually asked, sometimes out of nervousness and a desire to demonstrate more knowledge than necessary. When someone asks a direct, narrow question, and the response wanders into adjacent topics, unrequested background, or tangential information, it can create an impression of scattered thinking rather than focused expertise, even if every individual piece of information shared is technically accurate and relevant in some broader sense. Answering precisely what was asked, and only what was asked, then pausing to see if more detail is actually wanted, consistently reads as sharper than volunteering a flood of loosely related information. The fifth and final trap worth naming here is mismatched energy. Responding to a serious or high-stakes moment with a tone that is too casual, or responding to a low-stakes casual moment with a tone that is too intense and serious. Both mismatches create a subtle sense of disconnect in the listener, a feeling that the speaker isn't quite reading the situation correctly, even if they can't immediately articulate why the interaction felt slightly off. Calibrating your energy level to match the actual stakes and tone of the moment, neither underplaying something important nor overplaying something minor, is a subtle skill, but one that consistently separates people who feel emotionally intelligent and situationally aware from people who, despite good intentions, seem slightly out of sync with the room around them. There's a sixth trap worth naming separately, because it's subtle enough that it often escapes notice, even in people who have eliminated the more obvious habits already discussed. This is the trap of verbal throat clearing, opening a response with a string of low-content phrases before actually arriving at the point. Phrases like, "So? That's a really interesting question," or "Yeah, I think, there's a few ways to think about this." None of these phrases are individually harmful, but strung together at the start of nearly every response, they create a consistent delay between being asked something and actually answering it. And that delay, repeated across an entire conversation, creates a cumulative impression of someone who needs time to warm up before delivering anything substantive. The fix is not to eliminate all opening acknowledgement, which can feel abrupt if removed entirely, but to trim it down to a single brief phrase at most, and to train yourself to move into the actual content of your answer far more quickly than feels natural at first. A seventh trap, closely related to the qualifier stack discussed earlier, is what could be called retroactive undercutting, making a strong, clear statement and then immediately weakening it with a follow-up phrase like, "But that's just my opinion," or, "Though I could totally be wrong about that." This habit often comes from a well-intentioned desire to seem open-minded and non-arrogant, but it has the practical effect of erasing the strength of the statement that was just made. If a point is worth making, it's worth letting stand without immediately retracting its force. There is a difference between genuine intellectual humility, which involves being truly open to updating your view when presented with new information, and reflexive verbal softening, which happens automatically regardless of how confident you actually feel. And only the first of these is actually valuable. Recognizing these traps in your own speech requires a level of self-awareness that most people never develop, simply because nobody naturally reviews their own conversational habits with any real scrutiny. One of the most effective ways to build this awareness quickly is to record yourself during an ordinary conversation. A phone call, a casual discussion, a work meeting if circumstances allow, and then listen back, specifically counting occurrences of these traps: the qualifiers, the apologies, the throat clearing, the retroactive undercutting. Most people are startled by how frequently these patterns show up once they're actually counted, rather than simply assumed to be occasional. This single exercise, uncomfortable as it may be, often does more to improve perceived intelligence in speech than any other single piece of advice in this entire audiobook, because it turns an abstract awareness of these traps into a concrete, personal inventory of exactly which habits need the most attention. Chapter 10. The Power of Analogies and Mental Models. One of the clearest signals of deep understanding is the ability to explain something complicated using a simple comparison that makes the complexity instantly intuitive to someone who has never encountered the idea before. This is the power of analogy, and it is one of the most reliable tools available for sounding and actually being more intelligent in any conversation involving complexity. Anyone can memorize technical details and repeat them back. Far fewer people can translate those technical details into a comparison that makes an unfamiliar concept feel immediately graspable to someone without the same background knowledge, and this translation ability is one of the clearest external signals of genuine, rather than merely memorized, understanding. Consider the difference between explaining a complex system in its own native technical language versus explaining it through a well-chosen analogy rooted in something the listener already understands deeply. A technical explanation might be entirely accurate and still leave the listener with only a vague, foggy sense of what was actually said. A strong analogy, even if it simplifies some of the underlying nuance, gives the listener a mental scaffold they can immediately hold on to, and that scaffold often creates a far stronger and more lasting sense that the explainer truly understood the material, precisely because only someone with real command of a topic can strip away its complexity and still preserve its essential logic inside a simpler comparison. Building strong analogies is a skill that improves with deliberate practice, and it starts with identifying the core mechanism of whatever you're trying to explain, separate from all its specific technical details. Ask yourself, what is actually happening at the most basic structural level, independent of the specific field or vocabulary involved? Once you've identified that core mechanism, search for a different domain, ideally one that's widely familiar, where a similar structural pattern already exists. A financial concept might map cleanly onto a household budgeting scenario. A technical process might map onto something as simple as cooking a meal, with sequential steps, dependencies, and points where an error early on creates larger problems later. The specific domain matters less than the structural similarity between the two situations, and the more common and universally understood the comparison domain is, the more accessible your explanation becomes to a broad range of listeners. There is a risk worth naming here as well, which is choosing an analogy that breaks down under scrutiny or that oversimplifies to the point of being misleading. A sharp listener will sometimes test an analogy by pushing on its edges, asking about a scenario where the comparison doesn't quite hold. And if the analogy collapses too easily under that pressure, the collapse itself can undercut the credibility it was meant to build. The strongest analogies are chosen not just for how well they explain the core idea, but for how much of the underlying complexity they can accommodate before starting to break down. It is often worth mentally stress testing your own analogy before using it, briefly imagining a follow-up question or edge case and being prepared to acknowledge where the comparison stops holding rather than being caught off guard. Mental models operate similarly to analogies but function as reusable frameworks rather than one-time comparisons. Referencing a well-established mental model by name and applying it accurately to a new situation signals a broader, more structured way of thinking than simply reacting to each new problem as if it were entirely novel. This does not mean scattering references to frameworks and models indiscriminately, which can quickly start to sound like name-dropping rather than genuine application. It means having a small set of mental models genuinely internalized deeply enough that you can recognize when a new situation actually fits the pattern, and applying the model naturally as a lens for understanding, rather than as a decorative label attached after the fact. This is the difference between someone who has memorized a list of frameworks and someone who has genuinely absorbed a handful of them deeply enough to use as real thinking tools, and that difference is almost always audible in how naturally or how forcedly the reference gets woven into the conversation. There's a practical exercise worth building into your regular routine that develops this skill over time, which is deliberately practicing explaining things you already understand well to an imagined audience that has zero background in the subject. This constraint, imagining a listener with no prior context, forces you to strip away jargon and identify the true core mechanism of whatever you're explaining, because technical shortcuts and insider vocabulary simply won't work on someone without the background to decode them. Doing this regularly, even privately, without an actual audience present, builds a mental habit of always being able to access a simpler version of any idea you hold, which means that in a real conversation, that simpler, analogy-ready version is already available rather than needing to be constructed under pressure. It's also worth noticing how analogies function as a form of connection, not just explanation. When you successfully map an unfamiliar concept onto something a listener already deeply understands, you're not just transferring information, you're also signaling that you've taken the time to consider their specific frame of reference rather than simply reciting information from your own. This has a secondary effect beyond making the concept clearer. It makes the listener feel considered and respected as an individual, rather than treated as a generic recipient of information. And that feeling of being genuinely considered is itself part of what makes someone using strong analogies come across as not just intelligent, but also perceptive and socially attuned. There is a final layer worth adding here, which is that the best analogies often reveal something the speaker themselves hadn't fully articulated before finding the comparison. The process of searching for the right analogy frequently forces a deeper examination of the underlying idea than simply restating it in its original technical form would have required. This means that practicing analogy building isn't only useful for how you're perceived by others. It genuinely sharpens your own understanding of the material, because you cannot successfully map a complex idea onto a simpler comparison without first identifying exactly what that idea's essential, load-bearing structure actually is. In this sense, the skill covered in this chapter does something rare among the techniques in this audiobook. It doesn't just make you sound smarter, practiced consistently. It makes you think more clearly as well. And that clarity, in turn, makes every other technique covered so far even easier to apply. Chapter 11. Handling disagreement and pushback with authority. There is no faster test of perceived intelligence than the moment someone disagrees with you. Anyone can sound composed and articulate when a conversation is going smoothly and everyone agrees. The real signal of how sharp and grounded a person actually is emerges precisely in the moment their idea gets challenged, questioned, or directly contradicted. Most people fail this test, not because their underlying argument is weak, but because the way they handle the emotional charge of disagreement betrays exactly the kind of instability that undermines everything they've built up until that point. The most common failure mode is defensiveness, an immediate, reflexive push to justify and explain the moment pushback arrives, often before the other person has even finished stating their objection. This reflex comes from a very natural place. A perceived challenge to a stated position can feel like a challenge to the self, and the instinct to protect that self kicks in automatically. But defensiveness, however understandable, almost always reads as weakness rather than strength, because it signals that the disagreement landed as a threat rather than as simply new information to be considered. The people who sound most intelligent under pushback are the ones who have trained themselves to receive an objection the same way they would receive any other piece of information, with curiosity rather than alarm. The first practical move when facing disagreement is resisting the urge to respond immediately. This mirrors the pause discussed earlier in the context of listening. But it carries even more weight here because the emotional stakes are higher. A brief pause before responding to a challenge signals that you're actually considering the objection rather than reflexively defending your original position without processing what was just said. This pause does not need to be long. Even a single second of visible consideration changes the entire tone of what follows, transforming the exchange from a confrontation into something that feels more like a genuine collaborative examination of an idea. The specific language used to open a response to disagreement matters enormously. Opening with a flat, immediate no, or with a direct contradiction, tends to escalate tension and put the other person on the defensive in turn, which rarely produces a productive exchange. A far more effective opening acknowledges the validity of the concern before addressing it, something as simple as, "That's a fair point, and here's how I'd think about it," or, "I see why that could be a concern. Here's the piece of context that changes it for me." This is not about capitulating or pretending to agree when you don't. It's about entering the disagreement in a way that keeps the conversation collaborative rather than adversarial, which paradoxically makes your eventual counterpoint far more persuasive than it would have been if delivered as an immediate, unqualified rebuttal. There's an important distinction between disagreeing with an idea and dismissing the person who raised it. And the language used in disagreement should always make that distinction clear. Referring specifically to the argument, that particular approach runs into an issue with timing, rather than making any statement that could be interpreted as a judgment of the other person's overall competence or judgment, keeps the disagreement contained to the substance of the idea, rather than allowing it to feel like a personal attack. This precision in language is one of the clearest markers of someone operating with genuine emotional and intellectual control under pressure, because it requires actively separating the idea from the person holding it, even in the heat of an actual disagreement, when you are, in fact, wrong. And pushback reveals a genuine flaw in your position. The fastest way to maintain credibility is a direct, uncomplicated acknowledgement rather than a prolonged, defensive retreat. Saying something like, "That changes my thinking on this," delivered in the same steady, grounded tone used throughout every other part of a conversation, reads as more intelligent than either stubbornly defending an already disproven point or collapsing into an over-apologetic, flustered admission of error. The willingness to update a position cleanly, without unnecessary drama in either direction, is itself one of the strongest signals of intelligence available in conversation, because it demonstrates that your commitment is to being right, not to having been right from the start. There's a further layer worth understanding, which is how pushback dynamics shift depending on whether the disagreement is happening publicly, in front of others, or privately, one-on-one. Public disagreement carries an added layer of social pressure, because both parties are aware that a wider audience is also forming impressions based on how the exchange unfolds. In these settings, the pause and the validating opening described above matter even more, because an audience watching a defensive, escalating exchange tends to form negative impressions of both participants, regardless of who was technically correct. Handling public pushback with visible calm often does more for your reputation among the observers than winning the specific point ever could, because the observers are absorbing a lesson about your character and composure that will outlast their memory of the actual argument's details. It is also worth preparing, ahead of time, for the specific kinds of pushback you're most likely to encounter in your particular field or role. Reflecting in advance on the 2 or 3 objections most likely to arise around your typical positions, and thinking through calm, grounded responses to them before you're actually in the moment removes much of the emotional charge that would otherwise arise in real time. This is not about scripting artificial responses. It's about ensuring that when a familiar objection does arrive, you're not encountering the emotional jolt of surprise on top of the challenge of formulating a response, because you've already done some of that thinking in a calmer, more reflective state beforehand. There is one more dimension of disagreement worth exploring, which is the difference between disagreement that arises from a genuine difference in information and disagreement that arises from a genuine difference in values or priorities. Many arguments that appear to be about facts are actually about priorities dressed up as facts. 2 people looking at the identical situation but weighing different considerations as more important. Recognizing which kind of disagreement you're actually in changes how you should respond. If the disagreement is genuinely about missing or conflicting information, the productive path is exchanging that information directly and clearly. If the disagreement is actually about differing priorities, no amount of additional information will resolve it. And the more useful move is naming the underlying value difference explicitly. Something like, "It sounds like we're both looking at the same numbers but weighing speed differently than cost," which reframes the conversation from an unwinnable argument about who has the correct facts into an honest, transparent negotiation about which priority should take precedence. This kind of diagnostic clarity, correctly identifying what a disagreement is actually about before attempting to resolve it, is itself one of the sharpest signals of intelligence available in any difficult conversation, because it shows a level of meta-awareness that most people, caught up in the heat of the actual argument, rarely manage to access. Chapter 12. The Vocabulary Illusion. There is a persistent myth that a large, sophisticated vocabulary is one of the clearest signs of intelligence. And this myth causes enormous harm to how people actually communicate, because it pushes them toward exactly the wrong behavior. In reality, research into how listeners perceive speakers consistently shows that unnecessarily complex vocabulary, especially when simpler words would communicate the same idea just as accurately, tends to reduce perceived intelligence rather than increase it. This happens because complicated language that isn't necessary for the idea being expressed reads as an attempt to sound impressive rather than an attempt to communicate clearly. And listeners, even without consciously naming the feeling, tend to distrust language that seems designed to obscure rather than illuminate. This does not mean vocabulary doesn't matter. It means the relationship between vocabulary and perceived intelligence is far more specific than most people assume. The skill is not having access to the most obscure or elevated words available. It's having access to the single most precise word for a given idea. And that precise word is very often a simple, common one rather than a rare, elaborate one. Consider the difference between describing a plan as, "We need to utilize a methodology that facilitates cross-functional synergy," and describing the exact same plan as, "We need a system where different teams can actually work together smoothly." The second version communicates the identical underlying idea with dramatically more clarity. And clarity, not complexity, is what consistently reads as genuine intelligence to a listener. There is a specific psychological effect at play here worth naming directly, sometimes referred to as processing fluency. The human brain associates ease of understanding with trustworthiness and credibility, almost as a mental shortcut. When a listener has to work hard to decode what someone is saying, parsing unnecessarily complex sentence structures or unfamiliar vocabulary, that extra cognitive effort gets misattributed, often unconsciously, as suspicion toward the content itself, rather than recognized as simply a byproduct of unclear language. This means that speaking with unnecessary complexity doesn't just fail to demonstrate intelligence, it can actively work against you, making genuinely strong ideas seem less credible simply because they were harder to process. This principle has a very specific and important exception. And understanding where the exception applies is just as important as understanding the general rule. In highly technical or specialized settings, among an audience that shares the same technical background, using the precise, dense vocabulary native to that field is not showing off. It's speaking the actual, efficient shorthand of that domain, and avoiding it in favor of oversimplified language in that specific context can backfire, making you seem less credible to specialists who expect and rely on that precision. The skill, once again, circles back to reading the room, discussed earlier. The goal is never uniformly simple language or uniformly complex language. It's calibrating vocabulary precisely to what will land as clearest and most credible for the specific audience actually in front of you. There's a useful test worth applying whenever you're deciding between two possible words or phrases to express the same idea. Ask which version would be more immediately understood by someone hearing it for the first time, without needing it explained further. If a simpler alternative exists that loses none of the actual precision or nuance of the idea, choosing that simpler alternative is almost always the stronger move. Save genuinely elevated or technical vocabulary for the specific moments where no simpler word actually captures the same precise meaning, rather than reaching for complexity as a default habit. It is worth adding a word here about jargon specifically, since jargon occupies a strange middle ground between vocabulary and identity signaling. Used correctly, jargon efficiently compresses a complex idea into a single shared term recognized instantly by people inside a given field. Used incorrectly, jargon becomes a kind of verbal costume, worn to signal membership in a group rather than to actually communicate anything more precisely than plain language would have. The test for whether a piece of jargon is earning its place is simple. Ask whether removing it and replacing it with a plain explanation would take meaningfully longer or lose real precision. If the answer is no, the jargon is decorative rather than functional, and stripping it out will almost always make you sound sharper, not less credentialed. This single discipline, choosing the clearest available word rather than the most impressive sounding one, quietly separates people who are actually understood and respected in conversation from people who are, often without realizing it, working against their own credibility every time they open their mouth. There's a related habit worth examining, which is the tendency to reach for abstract nouns instead of concrete verbs and specific details, a pattern common in overly formal writing that tends to seep into speech as well when people are trying to sound impressive. A sentence like, "There was a facilitation of improved communication between the departments," buries the actual action, facilitating, inside a noun, facilitation, and adds a layer of passive distance that makes the sentence feel bureaucratic and vague. Compare that to, "The two departments started talking to each other directly," which uses an active verb and concrete subjects to describe the exact same underlying event with far more clarity and life. Training yourself to notice when you've turned a verb into a noun, sometimes called nominalization, and converting it back into direct, active language, is one of the most reliable ways to strip unnecessary formality out of speech without losing any actual precision. It's also worth addressing directly the anxiety that often underlies vocabulary inflation in the first place. Many people reach for more elaborate language specifically in moments where they feel less confident about their standing in a conversation, as though bigger words might compensate for an underlying insecurity about whether their contribution is valuable enough. This is worth naming honestly, because the instinct, while understandable, tends to produce exactly the opposite of the intended effect. The moments where you feel the strongest pull toward more complex, elevated language are often precisely the moments worth deliberately simplifying instead, because that simplification, delivered with steady confidence, does far more to establish credibility than any amount of vocabulary ever could. Simplicity, delivered with conviction, reads as mastery. Complexity, delivered with uncertainty, reads as compensation. Chapter 13. The physical roots of a powerful voice. Everything covered so far in this audiobook, the pacing, the tone, the pauses, the framing, ultimately traces back to something physical happening inside your body in the moment you speak. And understanding this physical foundation makes every other technique easier to apply consistently, especially under the kind of pressure that tends to undo careful preparation. The voice is not a purely mental or verbal phenomenon. It is a physical instrument, shaped directly by breath, posture, and muscular tension. And neglecting this physical layer means constantly fighting against your own body while trying to apply techniques that require a settled, grounded state to actually land. Breath has already been mentioned earlier in this material, but its role deserves deeper attention here because it is the single most foundational physical element underlying everything else. Shallow, high chest breathing, the kind that happens automatically under stress, restricts the amount of air available to support a steady, resonant voice, which is why anxious speech so often sounds thin, strained, or rushed, even when the speaker is consciously trying to sound calm. Diaphragmatic breathing, where the stomach expands outward on the inhale rather than the chest rising upward, provides a much larger and more stable reserve of air, which translates directly into a voice that can sustain a slower pace, hold a lower pitch, and avoid the trailing, breathless quality that undermines authority at the end of longer sentences. Practicing diaphragmatic breathing outside of actual conversations builds the physical foundation needed to access it automatically when it matters most. A simple practice involves lying down, placing a hand on the stomach, and breathing so that the hand rises on the inhale rather than the chest rising and the stomach staying flat. Once this pattern becomes familiar lying down, practicing it seated and eventually standing extends the skill into positions closer to how most real conversations actually happen. Over time, with enough repetition, this breathing pattern begins to persist even under the kind of stress that would previously have triggered the shallow, anxious breathing pattern, and that shift alone noticeably changes the baseline quality of the voice in high-stakes moments. Muscular tension, particularly around the jaw, throat, and shoulders, is another physical factor that shapes vocal quality in ways most people never consciously notice. Tension in these areas restricts the natural resonance of the voice, producing a tighter, more strained sound that reads as nervous even when the underlying content being spoken is calm and composed. A brief physical check before any important conversation, consciously relaxing the jaw, rolling the shoulders down and back, releasing any tightness in the neck, takes only a few seconds but measurably changes the openness and resonance of the voice that follows. This is not an abstract or purely psychological suggestion. It is a direct, physical intervention with an immediate, physical effect on how the voice actually sounds. Posture ties all of these physical elements together because posture directly affects both breath capacity and muscular tension simultaneously. A collapsed, slouched posture compresses the diaphragm, restricting breath, while also creating tension through the neck and shoulders as the body works to keep the head upright, despite the collapsed spine beneath it. An open, upright posture, whether seated or standing, does the opposite, allowing full diaphragmatic breath and reducing unnecessary tension throughout the upper body. This is true even in settings where nobody can see you, a phone call, a voice-only recording, a conversation happening while walking. The listener cannot see your posture, but they can hear its effects in every sentence you speak, which means posture is not just about how you appear, it is a direct, physical input into how you sound. There is also a connection worth drawing between physical state and the confidence-competence loop discussed earlier. Just as adopting confident vocal patterns can precede and generate genuine internal confidence, adopting an open, grounded physical posture before a difficult conversation can shift internal state in a similar way, even before any words are spoken. Taking 30 seconds before a high-stakes conversation to consciously stand or sit tall, breathe diaphragmatically, and release obvious tension is a small, almost invisible ritual, but it changes the physical starting point from which everything else in the conversation unfolds. And that starting point matters more than most people realize, because it is far easier to maintain a grounded, steady voice throughout a conversation than to recover it after starting from a tense, constricted state. Hydration and vocal warm-up, while less discussed than breath and posture, still play a meaningful physical role, particularly in longer conversations, presentations, or any situation involving extended speaking. A dry throat tightens and strains more easily, producing a rougher, less controlled vocal quality as a conversation goes on, especially in its later stretches when fatigue starts to compound the effect. Simple preparation, staying adequately hydrated in the hours before an important conversation and avoiding excessive caffeine immediately beforehand, which can both dry the throat and elevate the kind of nervous energy that undermines a steady pace, is a small, easily overlooked piece of physical preparation that nonetheless affects the actual mechanics of how controlled and grounded your voice remains over time. It's worth closing this chapter with a broader point about the relationship between body and voice that ties everything together. The mind and body are not separate systems operating independently, one purely psychological and one purely physical. They are deeply intertwined, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the voice, which sits at the exact intersection of thought, emotion, and physical mechanics. Every technique covered elsewhere in this audiobook, the pacing, the framing, the precision, the listening, ultimately depends on a physical instrument capable of executing it steadily. Investing in that physical foundation, the breath, the posture, the released tension, is not a separate, optional add-on to the more cognitive techniques covered throughout this material. It is the platform every other technique actually stands on. Chapter 14. Building Your Signature Voice. Every technique covered throughout this audiobook exists to remove the habits that quietly undermine how intelligent and capable you sound. The rushed pacing, the upward inflection, the unnecessary hedging, the vague language, the physical tension that thins out the voice. But removing these habits is only half of the picture, the other half. And the part that ultimately makes everything sustainable over the long term is developing a communication style that feels authentically like you, rather than like a performance you have to consciously maintain in every single conversation. There is a real risk, when first learning these techniques, of applying them so mechanically that they start to feel stiff, artificial, or disconnected from your actual personality. A pause held too deliberately starts to feel theatrical rather than natural. A downward inflection applied to every single sentence without variation starts to sound robotic rather than authoritative. The goal was never to replace your natural voice with a rigid technique. It was to strip away the specific habits that were working against you, while allowing everything else about how you naturally communicate, your humor, your warmth, your particular way of framing ideas, to remain fully intact and, ideally, to come through even more clearly once the habits obscuring it have been removed. Developing a genuine signature voice means identifying which of these techniques feel most natural to you personally and leaning into those first rather than trying to apply every single principle from this audiobook with equal intensity from day one. Some people will find that pacing and pausing come easily, but that vocabulary precision takes more conscious effort. Others will find the opposite. There is no fixed order in which these skills need to be mastered, and trying to overhaul every element of your speech simultaneously is far more likely to produce something that feels forced than gradually integrating one or two changes at a time until they become automatic, then moving on to the next. It is also worth recognizing that a genuine signature voice includes some amount of personal quirk and individuality. And this individuality is not something to eliminate in pursuit of some generic, idealized version of intelligent-sounding speech. The specific way you construct an analogy, the particular rhythm of your natural pauses, the specific kinds of stories you tend to tell, all of this contributes to a communication style that is recognizably, distinctly yours. And that distinctiveness is itself part of what makes someone memorable and compelling to listen to, rather than simply competent. The techniques in this audiobook are meant to clear away the noise that was obscuring your natural voice, not to replace that natural voice with a uniform, impersonal template that sounds the same regardless of who is speaking. Over time, as these techniques become less like conscious effort and more like an integrated, automatic part of how you naturally speak, something important shifts. You stop thinking about pacing or tone or word choice in the moment, the same way an experienced driver stops consciously thinking about which pedal does what. The skill becomes invisible, absorbed into an underlying competence that simply shows up automatically whenever you speak, freeing your conscious attention to focus entirely on the actual substance of what you're saying, rather than the mechanics of how you're saying it. This is the point at which the techniques in this audiobook stop being techniques at all and simply become the way you communicate. Full stop. It's worth naming one more element of a genuine signature voice, which is consistency across contexts. Someone whose communication style shifts dramatically and unpredictably between settings, sharp and composed in one room, scattered and hesitant in another, sends a confusing signal about who they actually are. A true signature voice holds its essential shape even as it calibrates to different rooms in the ways discussed earlier. The underlying steadiness, precision, and groundedness remaining present, whether the specific register is more formal or more casual. This consistency is often what people are actually responding to when they describe someone as having real presence. Not that the person is loud, or dominant, or the center of every room, but that there is a recognizable, stable quality to how they communicate, no matter what situation they find themselves in. Building this kind of consistency takes time, and it's worth setting realistic expectations about the timeline involved, because impatience is one of the most common reasons people abandon these techniques before they've had a chance to actually integrate. In the earliest stage, applying any of these techniques will require deliberate, conscious effort, and that effort itself can feel like it's working against the natural flow of a conversation, since attention spent monitoring your own delivery is attention not spent purely on the content of the exchange. This early stage is uncomfortable, but it is also temporary. With consistent practice, usually measured in weeks rather than days, the deliberate effort starts to fade into something closer to instinct, similar to how a beginner driver monitors every single action consciously, while an experienced driver reacts fluidly without deliberate thought. Recognizing that this discomfort is a normal, expected stage, rather than a sign that the techniques aren't working, prevents the common mistake of giving up right before the integration would have actually taken hold. It also helps to track progress in a way that's specific, rather than vague. Because vague self-assessment, "Am I sounding smarter?" is difficult to answer and easy to become discouraged by. A more useful approach involves picking one specific, observable marker at a time. Whether you manage to eliminate filler words in a given conversation, or whether you successfully paused before delivering an important point and reviewing honestly afterward how consistently that specific marker showed up. This kind of granular tracking makes progress visible in a way that broad, subjective impressions of your own communication style rarely can, and visible progress is one of the most reliable motivators for sustaining any new habit long enough for it to become automatic. Feedback from others, sought out deliberately rather than passively hoped for, accelerates this process significantly. Most people never directly ask the people around them how their communication actually lands, relying instead on vague inference from how conversations seem to go. Asking a trusted colleague or friend a specific, narrow question, something like, "Did that explanation feel clear, or was I talking too fast in that meeting?" produces far more useful information than general encouragement ever could, because it targets exactly the specific skill you're currently working on rather than inviting a broad, unfocused assessment. This kind of targeted feedback loop, practiced consistently over time, often shortens the path to a genuinely integrated signature voice, far more than solitary practice alone ever could, because it corrects blind spots that are, by their very nature, invisible from the inside. Chapter 15. The Transformation. Think back to where this audiobook began, with the uncomfortable truth that people judge intelligence within seconds, often before a single substantive point has actually been made. That reality has not changed over the course of this audiobook, and it will not change simply because you now understand it. What has changed is your relationship to that reality. You are no longer someone unknowingly at the mercy of split-second, surface-level judgments. You now understand the specific mechanics behind those judgments: the pacing, the tone, the precision, the framing, the listening, the situational awareness. And understanding those mechanics means you now have the ability to shape how you are perceived, rather than simply hoping your actual substance eventually shines through on its own. It's worth being honest about what this transformation actually requires going forward, because none of what has been covered here works through passive listening alone. Every single technique in this audiobook, the deliberate pause, the downward inflection, the diaphragmatic breath, the compressed story, the well-chosen analogy, requires active, repeated practice before it becomes something you can access naturally under real pressure. The people who will actually experience a shift in how they're perceived are not the people who simply absorbed this information once and moved on. They are the people who take a single technique, practice it deliberately in low-stakes situations, notice it starting to feel more natural, and then move on to layering in the next one, patiently, over weeks and months, rather than expecting an instant transformation after a single listen. Consider what actually changes in your life once these skills become integrated into how you naturally speak. Meetings where you once felt overlooked start to shift, because the moment you speak, people lean in rather than continuing to check their phones. Negotiations where you once felt at a disadvantage start to shift, because your calm, grounded delivery under pushback signals a level of control that changes how the other side calibrates their own position. Relationships where you once felt unheard start to shift, because the strategic listening covered earlier in this audiobook makes the people around you feel genuinely understood, often for the first time. None of this requires becoming a different person. It requires removing the specific habits that were quietly working against the intelligence and insight you already possess, and replacing them with patterns that finally let that intelligence be seen clearly by the people around you. There will be moments, especially early on, where applying these techniques feels effortful, even a little uncomfortable, because any new pattern feels unnatural before it becomes automatic. This discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the ordinary, expected friction of building a genuinely new skill, the same friction anyone would feel learning any new physical or mental discipline. Push through that initial discomfort, and something remarkable happens on the other side of it. The techniques stop feeling like techniques. They become simply how you talk, how you carry yourself in conversation, how you show up in rooms that once intimidated you. And at that point, something even more significant happens beyond how others perceive you. The discipline required to speak with this kind of precision, control, and clarity tends to sharpen the actual thinking behind the words as well. Because clear speech and clear thought are far more connected than most people ever realize. Start small and start specific. Pick a single technique from everything covered in this audiobook. The pause before an important point, the downward inflection at the end of a statement, the elimination of a single reflexive filler word, and commit to practicing that one shift in your very next conversation, regardless of how minor or major that conversation happens to be. Notice what changes, however subtly, in how the other person responds. That small, immediate feedback loop is what will carry you forward into practicing the next technique and the one after that, until the entire collection of skills covered here has quietly become part of how you naturally show up every time you open your mouth to speak. It's worth reflecting one final time on why this particular skill set matters so much more than it might initially seem. Communication is not a peripheral skill, separate from the substance of intelligence itself. It is the primary channel through which everything else you know, everything you've built, every insight you've developed, actually reaches another person. A brilliant idea that never lands clearly might as well not exist in the mind of the person who needed to hear it. A well-reasoned decision that gets undermined by hesitant, apologetic delivery loses the trust it deserved. This is not a minor inefficiency. Across a career, across relationships, across every room you will ever walk into, the gap between what you actually know and what you're able to make visible to others compounds, year after year, into one of the largest differentiators between people who are recognized for their capability and people whose capability quietly goes unnoticed. Consider, too, that everyone around you is operating under the exact same set of default habits this audiobook has spent its length dismantling. Most people rush their pace under pressure. Most people let their sentences drift upward into uncertainty. Most people bury their point under unnecessary qualifiers and apologies. This is not a criticism of those people. It's simply the unexamined default that almost everyone operates from, because almost nobody has ever been taught otherwise. This means that the moment you begin applying even a handful of the techniques covered here consistently, you are not just improving in some abstract sense. You are separating yourself in a very concrete and immediately noticeable way from the vast majority of people around you, most of whom will never examine these habits at all. There is a final thought worth carrying forward from everything covered in this audiobook, which is that sounding intelligent and being intelligent are not actually in competition with each other, despite how the title of this audiobook might have initially framed them. The techniques here were never about creating a gap between appearance and substance. They were about closing a different gap entirely, the one between the intelligence you already carry and the intelligence other people are actually able to perceive. Closing that gap does not make you someone other than who you already are. It simply means that, for the first time, the world around you finally gets to see clearly what was there all along. You already had the intelligence. What you were missing was the delivery system capable of making that intelligence visible to the people around you. That system is no longer a mystery. It has been laid out here, piece by piece, mechanism by mechanism, ready to be practiced, refined, and eventually absorbed so completely into how you communicate that it stops requiring conscious thought at all. The only remaining variable is whether you take what you've learned here and actually apply it, starting with the very next conversation you have. The gap between sounding intelligent and actually being seen as intelligent by everyone around you has never been smaller than it is right now. Close it